The highest goal of medicine is full enlightenment. And in this case, it is full yogic enlightenment according to the tantric system of dissolving the body back to the elements in consciousness that are basically energies of light.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Plant medicine is a term that more people are becoming familiar with. What's interesting to me is the level with which we group things like herbal medicine with quote-unquote alternative medicine or even the occult. I mean, every town is a little store where one can go buy their herbal medicines, or a section in their local grocery that caters to the plant people, maybe stocking herbal capsules or tinctures or other herbal products. But we're talking about basic things that grow outside in our backyards. Well, now that interest in plants as medicine has skyrocketed, it makes me reflect. Why did that ever become alternative? Indigenous medicines of various cultures are rooted in plant medicine. Well, maybe you've gotten the urge to get closer to plants. You need to know you aren't alone. They are some of the greatest teachers, and when you start studying this way, it awakens something very deep and wise inside you. Today, you're going to hear from a teacher of plant medicine with decades of study in several types of traditional Asian medicines and their spiritual lineages, making for an intriguing invitation for you to contemplate the purpose of your own human life and body. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today, I'm here with David Crow, who's the founder of Floracopia. David is a plant medicine expert, clinician, consultant, researcher, educator, and author. He's a specialist in Chinese, Tibetan, and Ayurvedic medicines and their spiritual lineages. Thank you for joining us today, David.
Well, thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to talk with you. We had a chance to speak recently, and I felt like you turned my brain into a soup. And I said, I got to talk to that guy again. I like it when somebody turns my brain into a soup. And I'm really excited to learn about your work more and your journey, because you've been in the field of plant medicine for many years, and many, many more years than I have been involved in this area. And you say that you are a specialist in Chinese, Tibetan, and Ayurvedic medicines and their spiritual lineages. And what does that mean, the spiritual lineages of these medicines?
Right, that's a big topic, and it is one of my favorite topics. Thank you for asking. The classical Asian medical systems that people are becoming more aware of now in the West, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and to some degree Tibetan medicine, are inseparable from the spiritual cultures and practices that these medicines came out of. And so what that means is that there was a shared commonality of medical and spiritual principles and concepts and practices that developed in all of these systems. So for example, in Ayurveda, we hear terms like prana, life force, and the diagnosis is based on Vata, Pitta, Kapha, which people are familiar with, but that goes back to the five-element theory. And therefore, if we just look at those two simple examples of a concept of life force, prana, and a concept of five elements, what we see is that those two concepts and those principles are also the foundation of many practices in Tantra and yoga that came out of the same culture. And so therefore, Ayurveda and Tantra and yoga and the Vedas are all woven together, and they borrow from each other. Then if we look at Tibetan medicine, what we see is that many of the principles and concepts also are derived from Tibetan Buddhism. And so we see one example that I have always found really striking is that Tibetan medicine has a very well articulated description of the 9 months of pregnancy and embryology, which is actually quite, even though it's somewhat quaint and poetic, it's actually strikingly accurate. And the difference, the main difference between this particular model and modern physiology is that this model not only describes the development of the embryo and the fetus, but it also describes the process of incarnation, what is happening with consciousness before the moment of conception, what happens to the consciousness during the pregnancy, what happens to consciousness during childbirth, and so forth, including all these various states and stages of either retaining or forgetting memory and self-identity at the time of death, and what happens in the bardo in between the end of life and reincarnation in the next body, and so forth. And all of this comes from various tantric teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, such as the Kalachakra Tantra. And so what we see then is you have a medical teaching that is very specific, describing embryology, but it's bringing in this dimension of what the incarnating consciousness is going through and experiencing as well. And so therefore, embryology becomes a very deep subject spiritually in that particular case, in that tradition. Another example is Chinese medicine has very close connections and similarities, parallels, shared cultural and spiritual lineages and practices with Taoism. And so therefore, we see that in Chinese medicine that Qigong is actually a medical treatment, just like in Ayurveda, yoga is a medical treatment. But in Ayurveda, yoga is not just a medical treatment because yoga is an entire spiritual practice in itself. And in Chinese medicine, Qigong is not just a medical treatment because Qigong is a complete spiritual practice in itself also. You see, so this is what I mean by the inner dimensions, the inner spiritual dimensions of classical Asian medicine. And so what we see then is that classical Asian medicine is inseparable. It is entwined with the spiritual cultures of the time and the place. And this gives us a very rich vein of study for approaching things that otherwise can be rather esoteric and abstract. And so I'll give you an example. People are increasingly familiar with the term prana, for example, from Ayurveda, and chi from Chinese medicine. Are prana, and what are prana and chi? And so in order to really understand this, first we have to understand, well, why is it important to understand this? And if we look at these spiritual traditions, these yogic traditions, meditative traditions, alchemical traditions also, if we look at these traditions, what we see is that in medicine, prana means something. It means it's flowing, it's healthy, it's abundant, it's depleted, it's blocked, and same in Chinese medicine with qi. But if we understand that there is a spiritual dimension that came from the parallel development of these medical and spiritual lineages, then what we see is that prana is an ultimate spiritual goal, and the same with qi. And if we delve into that, what we see is that prana is the foundation of so many different kinds of practices. People will immediately think of pranayama, the breathing yogas, but that is only the most external bodily based practice, which is used to control the internal prana, which is basically learning how to control the flow of subtle currents of consciousness. And the purpose of that is enlightenment, you see. And so the same holds true in Taoism, in Qigong, that there's a lower level of purpose in Qigong, which is to heal the body, but there's a higher level, which is to transform through inner alchemy the body and mind so that they can return to Shen, spirit. So in other words, we have a relative level of applying these principles like qi and prana and the 5 elements. These are the most basic things. There's many, many other aspects of Chinese, Ayurvedic, and Tibetan medicines that are also related to spiritual practices. But the life force and the elements are 2 of the most fundamental. And so what we see then is that there is a relative level that has to do with the body and has to do with healing. And then there's an ultimate level that has to do with liberation, illumination, enlightenment, whatever that means. And there's many definitions of what it means, actually. So I'll give you another example of this, and that's from Tibetan medicine. And that is that in the Tibetan medical teachings, there was a system that was codified, a series of medical paintings, tankas. And in one of the first in that series of 70 tankas, there's a picture of a tree. And the tree has these branches, and it has these small branches, and it has these leaves, and it has roots. And that particular tree of medicine painting is actually quite famous. If you study Tibetan medicine, it's well known. And what it shows is the whole foundation for achieving enlightenment. And this is a really curious thing because it's a medical system. But what is stated explicitly in this teaching is that the goal of medicine is enlightenment. And we actually see that also in Ayurveda, and we see it in Chinese medicine, that there's these different stages of medicine that have different levels of meaning. And all 3 of these medical systems say there are 4 stages of medicine, 4 levels of medicine. And the lowest level, which is said to be the inferior level, is actually treating illness. Okay, and that's rather curious because, well, why is treating illness inferior? Well, it's not. I mean, if you don't feel well, you don't necessarily care about enlightenment. You just want to feel better. And any doctor or any herb or even any pharmaceutical drug, I mean, anything that makes you feel better is a great blessing. But in these 3 medical traditions, they say that's only the beginning, okay? That just getting rid of the illness is only temporary because we're also going to just keep getting older and die eventually anyway. And the body is basically just this container of latent karmas waiting to ripen and latent diseases waiting to come. And so treating the symptoms is really superficial. So the second level, which is considered more superior, is prevention. And that's fairly easy to understand because if we can keep ourselves healthy, then it's a lot better than having to treat something once we get it. But then there's a third level, and we can ask the question, well, what's the purpose of prevention? Why should we have health routines that keep us healthy? And why should we try to stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible? And the third level basically says that the goal of prevention is longevity, okay? But it's very specific because it's not longevity like we have it now. What we have now with allopathic medicine, which has definitely increased the quantity of life considerably in many ways, but at the expense of quality of life. And so what we have now, unfortunately, is an entire population of elderly people who are not really alive. The cognitive function is greatly reduced, if not really badly damaged, and they're not really physically active. And so we have extended the quantity of life, but decreased the quality of life. And these natural medical systems from Asia placed a tremendous amount of importance on achieving longevity, but not that kind of longevity. Longevity with fully functioning mind and body. And one of the nice terms is free movement of the limbs and fully functioning mind and senses. Okay. And that's the goal. The goal is longevity with full cognitive capacity and full physical capacity. And that's a noble aspiration. And so that was the foundation of all 3 of these medical systems, is that it's not just about staying healthy, it's about preventing. And the purpose of preventing was so that we could have long, healthy life with a fully functioning body and mind in old age. But then the teachings go a step further, and this is illustrated so nicely on this Tibetan diagram showing the tree. And the tree has these flowers and fruits. And the flowers and fruits represent longevity and prosperity and well-being in a material sense. Okay, those are the flowers. But then the fruit of the flower is the highest goal of medicine, which is unsurpassed enlightenment. And of course, the Tibetan description of it is quite exotic, which is basically dissolving the body back into light. Okay, so this is closely related to the practices found in the Dzogchen lineage, the radiant body. Okay, and so again, we have an influence from the highest levels of spiritual teachings that have come into medical practice on a very practical level and influenced the system and said that that's the full realization of that. And so this radiant body lineage actually has produced many enlightened people and actual cases of people achieving this. It's considered to be a sign, for example, in this particular lineage, and apparently it has been documented even in modern times, where this is not the same as the Enlightenment in other kinds of traditions, deep insight into the nature of the mind and, freedom from fear of death and realizing impermanence and emptiness of identity and all these kind of things. This is actual yogic liberation where the practitioner dematerializes the body at the end of life, showing that they conquered the elements, you see. And that is explicitly stated in this medical system. And I find that intriguing because if we look at modern medicine, there's absolutely nothing beyond the first level at all. Now, I have great respect for modern medicine and for doctors, all kinds of doctors. And I do not ever think that the first level is inferior in any kind of way, but it's just pointing to the inner spiritual lineages that influence the thinking and the development of these medical systems. And this is why there is so much emphasis in all three of these medical systems on longevity, and therefore there's so much emphasis on rejuvenation, you see. And that is something that is extremely important to consider, not just for rejuvenation and longevity to support our spiritual practice, so that we live a long, healthy life with full cognitive capacity so we can actually achieve whatever it is that is important to us, our definition of spiritual illumination. But these methods of rejuvenation that promote longevity are also extremely important for actually preventing and curing illness as well. So we look at the epidemic of cognitive decline, and what we see in the classical Asian medical systems is we see things like Rasayana in Ayurveda, which is the rejuvenative therapies that support healthy brain function and give long life. And that means that even though we're talking about treating a condition, a medical condition in the first level, that what we really need is we need the higher levels of medicine for not just a physical purpose, but a spiritual purpose as well. So those are a few ideas, just to respond briefly to your excellent, very large, open question.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you expounded on the definition of enlightenment, because when you were using it way before you got there, I was like, I want to ask him what, I guess you probably have your own definition that you've put together from all of these different areas of study. But I was wondering if, what that was, what that definition was as you were going. And it is fascinating that as medicine has been practiced here, so I live in the United States, you live in the United States as well, and I know you've spent some time in Asia. And the way that we have our medical system set up today in the United States is very different than the traditional or any traditional medical system from any culture, because, the US has disentangled spirituality for the most part from medicine. And most of the developed countries have done that. And maybe you could say, sure, it's easy to do that in India, where, everybody's philosophies and worldviews are so based on the 5 elements, and that the Vedic system is so tied to Ayurveda and yoga and everything. And it might be easier to create a worldview and a system of medicine that is more intact when you haven't been presented with all these new variables and the separation of spirituality, I guess you could say religion as well, from medicine. Now that we have this situation here, there's such a big effort to reintegrate spirituality in medicine. There's an interest in it. And I think that's why someone like me and maybe someone like you long ago sought these forms of medicine, which we knew were not just physical. But what can be done on a bigger scale today to bring the spiritual back into the practice of medicine?
Well, now my brain is turning to soup. Several questions, actually. And I can say they're all related. I mean, you asked originally about some definition of enlightenment, and then we have the bigger topic of the need for some kind of spirituality in culture. That's what I am hearing in the question is, how do we bring spirituality back into medicine? That's a very good question. And that, of course, is a broader question. Why should we be even focused on spirituality at all? And all three of those are all very closely related questions. So I think the best way that I can answer that is just to talk about the application of these medical teachings to spiritual practice, okay? Because I don't know if there's any real value in talking about what we can do about society, because I don't think that, it's a noble aspiration, and this is a time of great opportunity. And this time of crisis is bringing out many heroic efforts and many forms of spirituality, such as compassion and empathy for the suffering of others and animals, and concern for the environment, and heroic efforts to lessen the impact of climate change and make political change, and all of these kinds of things. The way I look at the time we are in right now is that it is actually a drama unfolding in the human psyche. And it's really a story about humanity's spiritual aspirations versus its self-destructive nature, I guess you could say. And so what I see now is that we have a new form of spirituality that is emerging. And that form of spirituality is very much related to the health of the earth. And what's interesting is that this is in these classical Asian spiritual traditions and medical traditions. And the link is that the medical systems are based on the language of ecophysiology. So in Ayurveda, we have the system of 5 elements. And the system is earth, water, fire, air, space. That system's in Chinese medicine also, but a little bit different. But what's important is if we look at the system of earth, water, fire, air, space, it has a microcosmic aspect and a macrocosmic aspect. The microcosmic aspect is these elements are inside the body. Macrocosmic is that these elements are outside the body everywhere. But what's important is that the elements are the same inside and out. Okay. So in Ayurveda, we are taught that the elements combine to form Vata, Pitta, Kapha. We're taught that the elements have different qualities. And we are taught to diagnose the excesses or deficiencies of those elements. And we are taught to regulate and balance those elements. And a few very simple examples: excess fire is inflammation. And so we use anti-inflammatory herbs and therapies and diets. Okay. Deficient fire is something like hypothyroid. And so we use warming herbs and diet and therapies, you see. So we apply the elemental antidote to an elemental weakness or excess. Now that's the medical side of it. But here is where my personal experience diverged a bit from the teachings that I was receiving, because what I started doing was I started taking these teachings of the 5 elements and teachings of prana and chi and these other kinds of broader concepts, and I started studying them in the context of Vipassana meditation, which is body-based awareness. So we can learn about earth, water, fire, air, space intellectually and academically, and we can learn about all these herbs that are related. But then if you actually start to meditate on those elements inside the body, which is also part of Tantra and yoga, then a whole new universe opens up, because what you realize is that the sensations that give us a sense of who we are nothing more than the elements of the outer environment circulating through the inner body. what I mean by that is that we eat some food that comes from the earth and it circulates through the digestive system, which is mostly a hollow tube, and then it goes back out to the earth again. And it's producing sensations all the time and giving us nourishment. And if we don't have that food or it's the wrong kind, it produces all kinds of unpleasant sensations. But that's earth. And then the same thing happens. We have some water. And so we have a glass of water, and that water is not me. It's been around the universe forever, but it's not me. And then I drink that water, and now it's producing all these sensations of hydration. And I have the sensation that, oh, it's me. But then, an hour later, it gets filtered out of the kidneys and it goes back to the outer environment again. Same with the fire element. It's captured by the plants in photosynthesis, converted to the food chain, and then metabolic processes. Basically, the warmth of the body, 98.6 degrees, that's the combustion of sunlight. And every human being is combusting sunlight at exactly the same level. And it's in the opposite physiological mechanism as photosynthesis. So we're solar-powered beings, basically. And so air, the breath comes in, it moves around, it goes back out. And this is in an opposite pattern breathing with plants. So the plants are giving us oxygen, we're inhaling it, and we are using it to help us with the opposite metabolic process of photosynthesis. This is basically high school biology, okay? But if you really think about it and meditate on it, what you end up with is this profound realization that can actually be experienced at a physical level, where the boundaries of the self that we think are actually there and that our entire identity is based on, what we discover is that there's nothing there at all, okay? So if we look at the physical body, all we see really, if we go into it, is all we see is the nutrients from the earth and the fluid from the rivers and rain, sunlight keeping it warm, oxygen passing through it. And all of that is in a container of space. You see, the body is basically just an empty space that these other elements are moving through. And so that's the application of a specific concept that's inherent in classical Asian medicine, 5 elements. The body is made of 5 elements. But if we actually meditate on this, how the body is made of 5 elements, we can feel that the 5 elements are moving through the body. That's everything we feel. And it's very easy to dissolve the sense of self into a broader, unified field of consciousness that's based on the elements as opposed to based on the habituation of the mind to create a sense of self. And what I mean by that is, if we go deeply enough into observing the breath, eventually what happens is a sensation of inner and outer as being separate dissolve. And what we feel is a unified field where the breath is inside and outside. The atmosphere is inside and outside. And it allows us to pause for a moment in the stream of consciousness, the process that's called in Ayurveda ahamkar, the process that is always arising within us of feeling that we are a separate self. Because biologically, we cannot find that. And that's also what I love about these teachings, is that they are in alignment with modern science. And so if we look at the theory of the 5 elements, the concept of the 5 elements from Ayurveda, and then we start meditating on the elements in the context of Vipassana body-based awareness, we can actually see that there is no person, okay? That there is a sense of a person, but we can't really find that person. We can't find it scientifically, we can't find it biologically, we can't find it physically. You see, it's a process within consciousness.
Rumi said, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground, and maybe you've been trying all of them. You want to feel strong and grounded, and at the same time, you want that creative energy to flow freely through you. But something seems to be preventing it, and you're sick of the struggle. Maybe you found a little taste of the surrender that you're looking for while doing yoga, or meditating, or on a retreat somewhere. But how's it possible to find in real life? If you're ready to tap into the wisdom of the body and you want to build the feeling of community, I have a group for you, Body Church. Well, it's not really a church. It's a self-care membership program focused on your body, all of it. It's a gathering, a circle of the support you have been craving for you to dive into the intelligent functioning and poetry of your body more deeply than you've ever been able to before. If you want to be part of this very unique group program, head over to my website at heathergrish.com and see if we have a spot for you to try it out. That's heathergrych.com. We're starting to enroll people right now. Okay, I gotta stop you there. We can't find the person. But what about our genes and what about our DNA?
Oh, right. And what about our immune system?
Yeah.
And what about all the forms of the self that the body actually does have? Yes. Well, that is also in every organism. Even a microbe has a sense of self, you see. And here's another interesting thing about it is that the human body is actually made of more foreign microbes than its own cells. And so our sense of self is not reality-based because actually, if we look at it from the microbial level, we're actually a whole ecosystem of microbes, and every one of those microbes has its own sense of self, and every one of our cells also has its own sense of self, okay? So what we're talking about here is the sense of self, all right? But what we're also talking about is whether this sense of self is an ultimate reality or not. And this has something to do with enlightenment, okay? So what we can look for then is that both things exist. In other words, emptiness is form and form is emptiness, okay? In other words, both appear. There is something that is very obvious if you delve into this, which is that a person cannot be found in this flow of these biological elements, and yet there is a sense of self that arises. And every organism can be seen the same kind of way. But what does this have to do with spiritual practice? Well, what I think about it, and what my spiritual practice has led me to believe and to experience to different degrees, is that we have the opportunity as humans, and I think that this is unique to other animals and other life forms, we have the opportunity as humans to observe this process arising within the stream of our consciousness in a self-reflective way that other animals probably don't have to the same degree. So in other words, we can ask the question, who am I? And I think that's fundamental.
And isn't that where all the trouble begins?
Well, until we have an answer. And once we have some clarity on this, I think that's where all the trouble ends. Okay, because I think that the trouble that we're facing in a lot of ways really has to do with whether we're going to realize our biological unity or not, okay? So biological unity is a way of recognizing that the individual self is part of something else, okay? And so if you were asking, well, how can we bring spirituality back into medicine? Well, basically, more and more people are meditating and doing yoga, and if there was more and more of this, then medicine would change even more. It is being influenced already by these kinds of things. But let's just look at the situation of what's happening in the world right now. And what we can see very clearly is that there's a tremendous amount of conflict between all of these different things that don't matter anymore in humans, okay? It doesn't matter anymore what your race is. It doesn't matter anymore what your ethnic background is or your religious beliefs or anything like that. All of these things that we identify with as humans that we think are so important, these are all just going to be taken away as the earth goes into worse and worse environmental breakdown. You see, because all of the concepts of who we are as human beings don't matter in the face of the climate emergency. All that matters is that we have to realize that we are part of a broader organism of the biosphere. And if we can make that shift to realizing that we are part of a broader living organism that keeps us alive, then we can put to rest a lot of these obsolete things that we've been fighting wars about and torturing each other over and so forth. In other words, to just put it very simply, we need to stop fighting, stop arguing about all these kinds of things that don't matter anymore if you don't have water, okay? Or if the forests are on fire everywhere, or if there's floods everywhere. And so in that sense, this is a time of great opportunity for us spiritually because, you know, it doesn't matter if you are Democrat or Republican, if your home is flooded, if your entire city is flooded, you see, there's an elemental aspect of it that is stripping away all these illusions about who we are. And the earth is trying to tell us something very important about our true identity. So this is the link then back to these kind of elemental meditations that I was talking about, which is that we can recognize our biological unity with each other, and we can recognize our biological unity with the biosphere of the earth, and that helps us to deconstruct all of these things in our minds that we think about ourselves and others that we think are so important, and they're really not important at all, ultimately. So to go back to your basic question about the sense of self, what happens is that there is something going on in the stream of consciousness that can be contemplated, or we can ask, we can inquire into what is the nature ultimately of our consciousness. And that is something that is unique, not just among humans, that separates humans from animals and plants. It's also unique among humans to even have the interest or capacity to ask that question, you see, because the vast majority of people don't look deeply into who they are. They're operating in unconscious patterns. But when a person comes to the place that they can ask that question, who am I, at a deep spiritual level, and then they can start to practice spiritual practices such as feeling the body sensations and how that connects us to the biosphere, and dissolve our sense of self, or other kinds of practices like observing the arising and dissolving of the thought processes, we discover something quite amazing. And that is that there is this profound spaciousness inside our consciousness before it becomes identified with the body, before it becomes habituated to a sense of self, before it starts thinking of, oh, I'm a Caucasian middle-aged guy from Southern California. Well, there's an aspect of my consciousness that is completely free of that. And there's an aspect of everybody's consciousness which is completely free of its, egoic orientations. And so therefore we have the opportunity then that's actually being forced on us by environmental catastrophe, that we have to shift our deeper identity as humans to recognize our biological unity. And at the same time, we have the opportunity to do something meaningful with our life individually. Because in a certain way, every person, every generation, they have to face apocalypse anyway, whether it's war, famine, disaster. Human history has not been particularly easy. And that's been one of the reasons that spiritual practice has always been so valuable, is that it raises the question of what's the purpose and what's the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal, to go back to your question, has been defined in many, many ways. And one of the most fundamental ways that it has always been defined is that we find liberation from all of these restrictions, the things that bind us to this existence, the things that cause us to be incarnated over and over again, according to the classical Asian spiritual and medical lineages. And what that really comes down to is that we find that space inside our consciousness that is there, that is open, spacious, unconditioned, before it causes us to become, I guess you could say, enslaved or in bondage to the body and to existence. And so one of the terms that I like that describes the ultimate goal of spiritual practice in the Vedas and in Ayurveda also, it's called moksha. And this has a lot of different translations. Basically, it means enlightenment. It means that we have had self-realization. In other words, we have realized at a fundamental level that we are not the body and that we are not the external conditions, and that we have returned to our innermost enlightened consciousness. That's a simple definition of it. But there's another definition of it that I really like, and that is emancipation. And that implies that basically, if we're in a body, we're sort of like slaves, okay? And we're slaves to the physical needs. Everybody can relate to that, especially when they're sick, is that we got to feed the body, we got to clean the body, we got to detox the body, we got to get some sleep. I mean, basically all day long, we're kind of enslaved to the needs of the body biologically. But here's the thing about the word emancipation, is that it means, if we achieve moksha, it means that we are freed. And I like the implications of that. And very specifically, what moksha means is emancipation from bondage to the senses. Okay. Now, what that means is that we can live in the body, we can live in the world, and we can also be free, because bondage or emancipation, samsara or nirvana, are both processes that are taking place in our own consciousness. And nothing changes except how we perceive reality. So I think that's a good place to leave it.
That was great. I was just picturing all these little changes in neurological connections as you were talking. Wow. I know that you've been doing this for a long time. You have a company, Floracopia, and you're very much in the world of plants from that work. And yeah, it feels like a really big deal to be shifting into a different kind of spirituality that is more focused on the earth and the plants. And it feels so different for a lot of people, I think, than, I mean, I was raised Catholic and that has its own worldview. But this time that we're in now and the need to reconnect with the earth and the ways that we can do that, how do you see plant medicine playing a role in that?
Well, it's very important. And again, excellent question. Thank you. So this year, with the pandemic, there has been a tremendous explosion in interest in plant medicine. So I've been studying and practicing and teaching plant medicine for almost 40 years, and suddenly I'm relevant. Okay. It's important. The herb industry is experiencing exponential growth. Okay. Now, why is plant medicine important? Well, plant medicine does two things that pharmaceutical drugs cannot do. One is they provide nutrition to the body, and the other is that they support the detoxification of the body. Now, you can read the entire 4,000 pages of the physician's desk reference, and you can't find a single drug in there that does that. There's no pharmaceutical drug that gives the body nutrition, and there's no pharmaceutical drug that detoxifies. Okay. So what does that have to do with our modern life? Well, without nutrition, we can't rebuild and rejuvenate the vitality. And if we can't rebuild the vitality, we can't boost our immunity. Okay, so yes, there are some experimental immune boosting therapies that are coming out for cancer, but these are really radical, these are processes that can also kill a person. But it's also a specialized need, okay? And what we're really talking about here is what can ordinary people do to boost their immune system? That was the most common question of the entire year. Should I take this astragalus? What about the turmeric? And what about this antiviral herb and all of that? Huge interest in all of this. And that's important because now there's this revolution in self-care. More and more people are really interested in taking care of themselves. And so the plants can give us nutrition, all kinds of nutrition, healthy diet, medicinal mushrooms, immune supportive herbs, all of these kinds of things can really increase our vitality and our resistance and slow down the aging process, okay? And it's really good that people are learning about this. And the second thing is that you can't really ultimately cure disease without some level of detoxification. And this is badly misunderstood. People think everything is toxicity, flush, more laxatives, enemas, all this kind of stuff. And it's not like that, okay? So what we need is we need to understand that all illness has an aspect that requires nutrition to rebuild the prana and the chi, to strengthen our life force, which means increase our immunity. But all illness also requires a certain level of detoxification. And sometimes it's radical and very focused. And sometimes, most likely, it is just gentle support of the body's ongoing detoxification mechanisms. These are the two most important functions of natural medicine. Now, what's really interesting about this is that these are the two most important functions that plant medicines do, that they offer us. And if you look at it through the lens of biological unity and the 5 elements again, going back to that, what you see is that these two processes of rejuvenating the life force and detoxification are exactly what plants are doing in the environment all the time. You see, so there's a nice statement, a nice simple way to understand herbal medicine. And that is, we are consuming plants, whether it's food or herbs, to receive the benefits of compounds that they are producing for their own good. So, in other words, the plants were here a long time ago. They created the biosphere. We came along. Our body is made in a mirror image of plants physiologically so that we can absorb the nutrients they give us and combust the sunlight that they have stored. And whenever we find specific families of medicinal compounds, like essential oils, for boosting the respiratory immunity and antimicrobial powers, we frequently find that these compounds were produced by the plants for their own purposes. And we are using medicinal compounds that the plants produce for themselves for parallel human purposes.
Much like they would if we all still pooped on the ground and things like that.
Right, but the difference is that plants can live without us. We can't live without them, you see. As a matter of fact, they do a lot better. But the last concept here, why is this important, is because the pandemic is showing us the weakness of allopathic medicine in a lot of ways, and the pandemic is showing us the importance of natural medicine. Most importantly, though, the pandemic is showing us the importance of plants, because we need high quality nutrition and we need plant-based medicine for our immunity and for detoxification. And once we know that that's what the plants are doing out there in the environment all the time anyway, and then we connect that with the understanding that there's 10,000, 100,000 million other viruses that are going to be coming out of a breaking down ecosystem, we understand that we need plants. We need plants in the environment to produce a healthy ecosystem first, because no human being is going to survive a breakdown of the biosphere. Okay. And we may survive this pandemic, but then there's going to be another one and another one and another one. And the answer to that is we have to replant the global garden. In other words, we have to change our social priorities to realize that we have virtually no power over the earth, except to basically take a humble role and live with respect and reverence for the elements that keep us alive, and to recognize that the main players in regulating the health of the biosphere is the plant world, you see. And so if we make that a social priority, political priority, economic priority, the earth can be healthy. The earth can be rejuvenated. The earth can be detoxified, because that's what the plants are doing. And there can be abundance of foods and medicines and oxygen and clean water. And all of these kinds of things all go back to the functions of the plants and the environment. And that's why plant medicine is important, because when people consume a plant medicine, the intelligence of that plant goes into their body. And that intelligence of that plant is millions and millions of years old. So what we're really doing when we consume plant medicine is we are connecting to the ancient pranic, evolutionary, immunological intelligence of the plants that's helping to remind us now in modern times. It's helping to remind us that we're part of something very old, and that this ancient intelligence can support us now at a practical level, meaning our immune system. And so, even though at an ultimate level in consciousness, there's nobody there, there's just this pure awareness experiencing all of this play and samsara of the elements, we still need our immune system. And so therefore, that's a spiritual aspect of relating to the world. So I hope that more clarifying than confusing.
No, that was great. And, it's just one of the observations I had when the pandemic started was how many people started planting and growing at home.
Right.
Where they weren't doing it before. And it's almost like in the chaos, everybody also started watching weird sort of distracting TV shows on Netflix about the most bizarre thing that they could find in order to take their mind off of the situation. But some good things happen as well with the planting. And it's almost like this inner knowing of this is really important right now.
Yes.
So thank you so much for sharing that. David Crow, you have an amazing book, In Search of the Medicine Buddha, that you wrote in 2000.
Correct.
And you have a company, Floracopia, where you produce and sell plant medicines and essential oils. And I know you're a teacher, and so there's a lot of different ways to connect with you. Is there anything that you'd like to tell the audience here about today as far as the best way, or anything interesting coming up that they might want to connect with you on?
Sure. You can find me at floracopia.com, which is Flora, Floracopia, Copea. You can also find my courses over at The Shift Network. And that's just like it sounds, The Shift Network. And you can also find my consultation page at crowconsultations.com, just like it sounds, crowconsultations.com. So there's 3 addresses that you can find me at, and just say thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's been really great speaking with you today, and I'll make sure and get those addresses up in the show notes. And thank you, because this is just so important for all of us to hear, and I really appreciate sharing your story today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.